Engage your brain and enter the mind's eye, your one-stop shop from politics to paranormal and everything in between. I'm your humble host, Brian Turnov, and you're listening to The Mind's Eye. We've landed safely and settled here in the land of eternal sunshine, the great state of California. It feels great to turn the power back on in the new studio and get the show finally back up and running from our unusually long summer hiatus. But where exactly does the power to run the computer, to run the microphone, to run the lights, where does it all come from? It's kind of something I've always taken for granted, and will it always be there? And where will the energy come from in the future? Well, the answer really isn't as simple as electricity. Dr. Gretchen Bakke, cultural anthropologist of the University of Chicago, takes a digital seat at the table to answer these important questions, which are explored in her new book, The Grid, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Energy Future. Pretty indisputable is that America's electrical grid, it really is an engineering triumph of the 20th century, but it is turning out to be a poor fit for the present. And it's not just that the grid has grown old and is now in dire need of basic repair, but today, as we invest great hope in new energy sources, solar, wind, and other alternatives, the grid is what stands most firmly in the way of a brighter energy future. We'll explore the largest machine in the world, its fascinating history, its problematic present, and its potential role in a brighter, cleaner future. On the other side of the break, this is The Mind's Eye. Today is September 15th. About 2 to 3 days ago was the 20th anniversary of rapper Tupac Shakur's death. A complicated man, a complicated life, and an even more complicated death. One of the biggest questions that remain is who was responsible for the murder of Tupac Shakur? According to the FBI, Tupac's death was tied to Eazy-E, Death Row Records, and none other, and unexpectedly, the Jewish Defense League. Read the article now on our social media pages, Twitter @Mind's Eye Show, the same for Facebook.com/Mind's Eye Show. You can also check it out on our website, themindseyemedia.com. Up next, Dr. Gretchen Bakke on America's Energy Future, The Mind's Eye. We'll be right back. We're back on The Mind's Eye. We're reaching a critical point in America's energy infrastructure as we realize the country's electrical grid is growing old and vulnerable. Politicians, engineers, and citizens alike are facing a tough choice on planning for the present and future. Dr. Bakke's new book, The Grid, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Energy Future, contends that our current electrical grid is what stands most firmly in the way of a brighter energy future. Let's explore this vantage point. Dr. Bakke, welcome to The Mind's Eye.
Hi, thank you.
Electrical grids usually don't fall under a cultural anthropologist area of research. How did you get turned on to this important topic?
You're completely right. So there is an anthropology of science and technology, which was not what I did before I started working on this. I worked on Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, and what happened is that I came back, and I was visiting my parents who live in the Pacific Northwest in rural Oregon, and I noticed in conversations with them over the course of years, I would say, so starting maybe in 2003, and then sort of slowly increasing over time, that they and their friends were beginning to tire of the number of outages that they were having. And then that tiring at some point became all kinds of actions that they were taking, different people doing really, really different things. But the thing that they had in common was that they were deciding to take control of their energy security, I guess is how you would say it, and to make power for themselves, to get diesel generators, to go to gas heating and lighting systems, to all sorts of different things. They can't do a lot of solar because there's no sun, because it's the Pacific Northwest, and they can't do a lot of small wind because it's not allowed within their town. So the sort of the green part of the story wasn't necessarily part of it in the beginning. But what interested me was that there was a strong sort of exit from this feeling of taken for granted, that the infrastructure is taken for granted. And then I started to look around, and I noticed that was kind of happening everywhere, but in these little pockets, and it hadn't percolated up yet at that point into public consciousness. And I said, this seems like something that's worth investigating. And then almost immediately after I started looking into it, I thought, this is not an academic project. Nobody knows how the grid works, myself included. So I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to go talk to all the people, and then I'm going to try to take it and make it the human story that it is in fact, the national story, the local story, that it actually is, and make that part of it really clear as well, because we're always pushing at the grid, and the grid is always pushing back at us, and it's not just this machine in the sky or these power plants. It's a system in which we are both entangled, but also our actions have a great impact upon it. So it just grew and grew and grew, and it took me 5 years, maybe 7, to actually be able to understand the technology well enough to be able to write about it in very straightforward terms, to make it so that people who were where I was when I started could actually understand what I was talking about.
And I think that's what you bring to the table most of all. This is an issue that electrical engineers have been talking about, quite frankly, for a long time now. But bringing the human quality and making it tangible for people who don't understand it is really what you're bringing to the table as a cultural anthropologist and what you're adding to the conversation here. Let's talk a little bit more about that technical side, because as you just said, most people don't really understand it. I mean, quite frankly, we're talking how it's aging and vulnerable, but it's still a technical marvel. I mean, I'm constantly amazed by it, by the different areas that I've lived in, mountains, canyons, suburban, rural. But as you said, I really don't understand how does it work. So explain a little bit of the technical side. Really, what does our current power system run on, and how is electrical power generated?
So it's the grid. Well, let me go back one step from that, and then I will talk about what the grid is. There's these amazing pictures in the archives at the Huntington Library out just outside of LA, from Southern California Edison building their grid, and they're hauling all of the pieces for what we see as this massive machine, like turbines and poles and wires on horseback. So it's this thing that predates actually the internal combustion engine. We were using electricity. We were building the electric grid that we still have today with teams of horses. So it's just sort of, it's a marvel both in what it does and sort of allows for us, but also just in the fact that it exists at all. It's just completely incredible. So we have in America, in the U.S., we have 3 grids. Actually, we say the grid, but it's actually 3 separate systems, and 2 of them are the size of half of the continent. So there's one for the west and one for the east. Absolutely massive, and it's a single machine. And the third is Texas, so they have their own, and there are reasons for that we could talk about if you want. But the half-size continent ones and the Texas one actually are all of the ways of generating power, which is to say hydroelectric power or coal-fired power plants or nuclear power plants or geothermal plants or rooftop solar or wind power, whatever it is, natural gas that we use to make power. Every single power plant, little or huge, is wired into the same system. So they're linked by these big transmission wires and by the littler distribution wires, which are the ones we see in our neighborhoods. And all of those actually connect to all of our machines. And it's not that electricity isn't like water, so it's not like you turn it on and it sort of puddles inside your toaster. It actually runs through the toaster, and the toaster is designed to not stop it. So it runs through it, sort of slows it down, which is called resistance, and that resistance produces heat, or in certain cases it produces mechanical power to run the motor in your washing machine, for example. But so the grid is this all of these ways of making electricity, the ways of transmitting electricity, and then all the things we have from our cell phones, to a smelter, plugged into that system, but not us. So we're always, because electricity will kill us, we're always outside of it. So we interact with the machines, or the outlets, but it's made so that we can never touch it, it's there all around us. It's sort of ambient, in a way, but it's not strictly speaking for us. It's for our mechanical world, and we just keep adding machines to that. It's a remarkable substance. Electricity, a force, I guess you would have to say, not really a substance, but it's a remarkable force because it really does run things well. We've manufactured a world that runs well on it, and it's a common currency. It's very easy to take all different kinds of things and translate them into an electric current.
One of the interesting characteristics about electricity is also one of its biggest issues, because it would seem, let's take that next step for someone who doesn't know. For me, it'd be like, all right, well, we can produce electricity anytime we want. Why can't we just store it and have it when we need? But that is not really how the electricity works. Go into a little bit of that, because that causes a big issue too.
Yeah, and I think the easiest way to think of it is just like, okay, let's just store some gravity and make a really heavy box over there.
Right.
You know, like
it would seem to be easy to take that next step.
When we're talking about things, it's easy to think about storing a thing. I can store an apple, I can store water, I can store natural gas, but forces are different, and so the project of storing electricity is not the same at all as storing anything else. And yet we tend to think of it like it's a thing because we think of coal, which is how we make electricity, as a thing. We pull it up out of the ground, we put it on a train car, we can put it in a giant pile, and then we can combust it when we need it. And even Thomas Edison, he made this mistake, which is that when he was designing his electricity business, he designed it along the lines of a natural gas business. And it simply, he couldn't compete with gas because gas could stockpile and he couldn't. And so the way that the electricity business works, it works in time, which is very counterintuitive for everything else we think about. It works sort of in space. And electricity, to make the system work, you need to balance it over the hours of the clock. You always have to be thinking in terms of temporal organizations as opposed to where am I going to put it. So we can go into detail on that. I have no problem. That's super exciting because it's actually how we got the big grid that we have today. But
yeah, please do.
The thing that sort of stands in the way of really getting a lot of renewables into the grid, or sort of upgrading the grid right now, is this issue of, like, it would all be a lot easier if we could store electricity. So people are working very hard on figuring out a way to make some sort of big way, sort of grid scale way, to make storage possible. And there isn't really a good answer right now. There are a lot of things that work in certain places, and there are some little things that work, but
and isn't
massive scale, it's hard.
Yeah, that seems to be the issue. Now, Tesla is working on a battery storage, but does that deal with electricity, or is that really more and some other type of energy source?
No. That's and that is electricity. And what's interesting, so he had a small battery for people's home. If you had a home solar system, you could have this small battery put in. But just a couple of weeks ago, not Tesla, Elon Musk.
Right, Elon Musk, the Tesla company. Excuse me.
It's funny because I always see I see Tesla's face pop up into my
I know, because as I'm researching it, all I keep seeing is Tesla. So that's where my brain is at right now.
Yeah, exactly. So Tesla just released, the company just released a battery that is in fact, a couple of weeks ago, that is in fact large enough and built in such a way that it can store electricity for a house which would then run off the grid for the most part. And for the moment, people don't really, in my experience, go off the grid because it's a little bit too complicated. So unless there's really a reason why they can't get on it, like they have to pay their utility to run $20,000 to put in one more pole to run the wire to their house. In those cases, people will build their own electricity systems. But there is a growing irritation with the fact that if you have solar panels on your house, if you've invested in putting solar panels on your house, you are always feeding that electricity into the grid, and then the electricity that you use is coming from the grid. And that means if there's a blackout, you also black out. And I think that the feeling of frustration around that is part of what's driving this market for, well, maybe we can just put a home-size battery in and get off the grid completely. And hopefully, and this is my hope, those people will still be connected to the grid when things are well, and still be producing electricity for the grid when things are well, because the grid is the thing that actually links us it's not the thing, but it's one of the things that links us into a nation of equal opportunity, and I think that that is still really important to many Americans, that there is electricity available to everybody that's the same quality and that's at a fair price. So privatization is the way it's happening legally in most places is that one still contributes to the big grid, even when having the capacity to run one's house as an isolated thing, an island is what they call it.
And there's always been that push and pull between, I guess, the the power companies and the consumers. Consumers, if they had a choice, they would probably want more of a direct or local current that they could use in case of these blackouts. That's just not an issue now with renewables and other sources. That's an issue that's kind of always been happening.
Yeah, but the grid has gotten more fragile. So all the way up through the 1960s, and all the way up, I mean, from the end of the 1940s when we got universal electrification through the end of the 1960s, the grid worked extremely well. So there weren't outages to the degree that we have them now, and the business model was also highly functional at that point. It was premised on some things that actually weren't true, but they held true for a long time. They weren't absolutely true, but it was the idea that one could continue to build bigger and bigger power plants that were more and more thermally efficient, and thus produce electricity for a cheaper and cheaper price, more electricity for less money. That was sort of a truism that came, that was developed in the 1910s, and it held until 1968. And so, in a way, the problems that are besetting our grid now, they were there even before the renewables started to make their way in. There was already a crisis in the making. And I can go. Why don't I go back, if you're okay, and just talk a little bit about what happened in the 1910s?
Yeah, please do, because I come from the issue, and generally our listeners come from the issue. To understand any contemporary issue, we have to look into the history of it.
Yeah. So many people know the sort of beginnings of the grid because of the Edison-Tesla sort of boxing match over direct current and alternating current, which Tesla won. And we have the alternating current is what we use today. But there was a next piece of that. So Edison sort of retired. He pulled back from public life. Tesla was kind of crazy. And so he wasn't really a businessman, but his side of things was taken over by George Westinghouse, a name we still know today. Mm-hmm. But then the business of electricity was very sort of chaotic and piecemeal. There were many electric companies. I think Chicago's Loop had over 40 in 1890, so 1892. So you can imagine there was all of this competition and not any real standardization, and also not in the machines that anybody were using to make electricity, but also that ran on electricity. And there was a man named Samuel Insull who decided that he wanted to build a monopoly in Chicago. So he wanted to have an electric company that had total control over this particular city's power production, distribution, and billing. And the way that he did that is he realized that to make any money at all, he had to run his power plant, which was coal-fired, full bore all the time, so 24 hours a day. And what that meant is he needed people, because we don't store electricity effectively, he needed people to use that electricity full bore 24 hours a day. And that meant collecting different kinds of users and bringing them, connecting them into his network. So he got the streetcar companies who'd been making their own electricity to run streetcars in the mornings and in the evenings. He pulled them in by offering them rates that were cheaper than how they could make it themselves. He pulled in the office buildings and offered them very good rates, and that was for evening time electricity, so for lights for the evening, especially in the winter, that was needed. He tried to pull in houses and apartment buildings for nighttime, so sort of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 p.m. And remember, at this time, there's no appliances. So electricity is power and it's light, and that's it. So residential. So then you have street lighting for overnight use. And then he went to the factories and he said, the only way I can make this work is if you guys start to use electric motors for everything, as opposed to just running motors on site. You actually buy our electricity and put in new motors and run electric motors for everything. And I'll sell you electricity for basically for free if you'll run in the middle of the night and run in the middle of the day. And so in this way, he fills up his clock. You can actually see the clock coming so that he can run his power plant all the time. And we still today, we talk about the problem of excess electricity with solar making too much at noon and wind making too much when the wind blows very, very hard. But in fact, excess was always a problem because power plants, you can turn them down at night, but then you lose money because you're not making electricity. So to run a power plant all the time, you have nighttime. You have a nighttime excess of electricity. And so this is how we get the utility as a monopoly. And it's how the idea that if a utility controls a particular landscape, say Chicago, there's no competition from another utility within that area, within that service area. And the way that they convinced the federal government to allow this to happen in an era where there was a lot of legislation trying to cut down on monopolies because they were quite popular and not very good for the nation, was to enlist regulators' help. So Samuel Insull essentially said, we will let you set the price for our electricity at a reasonable rate if you will let us control this whole region, because he needed to have power 24. He needed to have a draw on his power 24 hours a day, and so there was a sort of a consensus that grew up between regulatory bodies, which were part of governments, state governments, and also the federal government, and the utilities, which were called natural monopolies, which meant simply that the price of their product did not go down with competition. The price of their product went up with competition. And in the 1970s, it suddenly, and very much accidentally, was proven not true that the price of electricity would go up with competition. In fact, it was possible to make electricity more cheaply, often by alternative means, and certainly by cogeneration, which means sort of extra. You have a plant that is very hot, and you just use the heat to make electricity. You don't do anything special. You just have a lot of extra heat around. So you can run a turbine, electric turbine, a heat engine, produce electricity. So there were these various ways in which electricity could be produced more cheaply. And in the late 1970s, that idea, and this is where anthropology maybe comes into it, that idea began to crack open the long-standing 70-year agreement, essentially, between the government and the utilities to provide uplift and electric power to everyone. And also in the 1970s, everyone who wanted electricity pretty much had it. It was at a price that almost everybody could afford. And we all had all this stuff that ran on it. So GE was an Edison General Electric back in the day, and it's no accident that they became a refrigerator manufacturing business, because once everyone has electricity, the only way you can make any money is to get people to use more of it. That's a little piece of the history that gets us to where we are now, and I think it's important to understand that utilities are not sort of bad guys, but they're rooted in a business model and a set of regulatory relationships that I think we as people are often blind to.
And sometimes not even blind to it. Sometimes maybe we feel powerless to it. And that's something we're going to talk about maybe a little bit later. Let's take a quick break. And because we're left off now in the last 30 years, let's bring it to present time. When we come back, we'll talk about renewable energy and today's vulnerability of the America's energy infrastructure. We'll be right back with Dr. Bakke in a Mind's Eye moment. We're back with Dr. Bakke and discussing her latest, The Grid, the fraying wires between Americans and our energy future. And we left off in the last, bringing us to the 70s, the history, and kind of where we are at this moment. Let's talk about the present. How is the electrical grid vulnerable? What are the specific ways that it's aging?
The biggest vulnerability to it right now is the ways in which the old system, the old structures of the system don't quite work with the way renewable power is made. And that would be a problem no matter what, because people and investors like renewable power. But it's also a problem because coal is in fact being retired out. So by 2020, a fifth of the coal burning plants we had in 2008 will be closed, and there's no plan to replace those. So you just see these plants are being shut and being shut and being shut, and a lot of them are being replaced by natural gas, and a lot of them are being replaced by wind. And both natural gas and wind work a little bit differently. Natural gas, it's still a fossil fuel. We can still burn it whenever we want to make power however we want, but the plants are smaller. So the metaphor that I kind of like to use for this is that it's like taking your old Dodge pickup truck and replacing it with 4 jetpacks. So it's not like you're taking your Dodge and you're getting rid of it, your fossil fuel Dodge, and you're getting rid of it and you're getting a hybrid or something that looks like the same kind of car, right? You're actually getting, it's still fossil fueled, they're jetpacks, but they're much smaller, and they have the they can be further apart, they can be in different places than that one central generating station. And so it's a very minor change, but even that kind of change means that electricity is being made in different quantities and in different places than where it had been previously. And it seems so simple, but since the grid is instantaneous, and since we can't really see it in real time, each shift, you take a power plant offline, for example, and all the electricity on the grid is moving in a different way than it would normally be. So each of these shifts change things. And then you throw in a bunch of solar panels, right? Rooftop solar panels. And what you get is something like a crowd of bee-sized drones whose job is to pick you up and your kids and take them to school, right? So it's like, now they're solar powered, but they're tiny and they're everywhere. And they move differently. It's not that they don't make electricity. It's just that they make it in a different quantity. They make a different kind of electricity. In this case, it's not so much that it's a different kind, but they produce DC power, which is sort of moderately important, but not super important. But it's that they're producing electricity that is volatile. So it is there when the sun is shining on them, and it's not there when the sun is not shining on them. And that's very different than using natural gas or using coal. We don't make electricity out of oil in the U.S., but except in Hawaii. But it's just these things, each of these shifts, they stress the grid, and some of them stress the grid much more than others. And the variable renewables, which is wind and solar, which are our favorite ones, are the hardest thing to adapt to without rethinking, sort of reimagining, and then rebuilding bit by bit the grid that we have to follow a different kind of logic.
So to kind of sum up what you're saying, if I'm getting this right, just so I'm on the same level, as we incorporate, because I mean there's so much going on there. So as we incorporate renewable and varying sources of energy that we originally weren't part of the grid is that's becoming a big issue for it to incorporate.
Yeah, and you can just imagine this: like you have. If you put solar panels on your house, let's just say you're going to do that, right? So you're going to put solar panels on your house. Now you're making a tiny little bit of electricity, which is leaving your house on what used to be a distribution line. So it brought electricity to your house, and that's all it did. Your meter is running backwards, and it's going out, and you're producing electricity. You're traveling it on these local lines, not on the big ones, but on the little ones. And it's going maybe to your neighbor, or maybe it's going across town. Or maybe it's going everywhere at once somebody turns on their porch light. You know, that's your, I don't know why they do that during the day. Let's see. Someone turns on their blender. That's your electricity that's making that blender run. Meanwhile, when you turn on your blender, it's not necessarily the power from your solar panel that you're using, but it's power coming in through that line, turning your meter the other way. So there's a piece of the system which was always just used to deliver electricity, and now it's being used deliver electricity from a single point that was far away, and now it's being used to transmit electricity in two directions over a very tightly networked urban environment. And that was just never how it was before. And because of that, then upgrades need to be done on that system. That system needs to be cared for differently. It needs to be accounted for differently. It becomes weaker because electricity is being made and used differently upon it. Does that help?
It does. Now that brings us to a point where it brings us to the point, well, which one would be easier, which one would be better, or I guess what's the route we should go? Would we redo our whole electrical grid system, or go straight to renewable energy? Like, for example, let's say Obama or the next president goes up to you, Dr. Bakke, and they say, you are the new Department of Energy's, the head of the Department of Energy. What would you do to our electrical grid to make it better? How do we fix this issue?
Oh dear. I would say, I think that that's probably not what they would say. I think what they would say is, it seems like we're going to need to transition to renewables because of global warming, because we've signed on to various accords. So let's say that we need to do that. How are we going to make it so that that just doesn't produce a lot of blackouts? Right? And it can produce a lot of blackouts because, for example, if you don't have some sort of storage, you have electricity when the wind is blowing and when the sun is bright. So that's one problem. If you don't have some other way to make electricity at night, for example, with solar, then you don't have any electricity. So that's one way that you could have a lot of blackouts. Another way is that the utilities are having a lot of trouble keeping the grid up because their revenue stream is not functioning the same way it used to. So they used to make power and distribute power and bill for power, and now they distribute power, and sometimes they don't even bill for it. Sometimes they now pay you to make it, right? So somebody has to take care of the grid. So who is that going to be? If it's going to be the utilities, we have to figure out a way to make sure that they can stay open for business. And I think that's one of the great problems in front of us is just to understand that this is an infrastructure that needs care. I would probably look at the two sides, the two big grids in the U.S., and they seem to be developing in quite different directions. And I think it would be interesting to let that happen. So to let there sort of be a Western way in which renewables become integrated, and an Eastern way in which renewables become integrated.
Now let's pull it back just a little bit. I want to make it the vulnerability. And you go into in your book, The Grid. You have a great example how the 2003 blackout in northeastern United States is like a quintal example of why the electrical grid is fragile. Go into a little bit more about that. What did we learn from that blackout?
What we learned from that blackout is that we need to cut back our trees.
Simple as that.
No, we learned a lot of things from that blackout, but it was, in fact, the actual causes. There's sort of underlying causes and sort of immediate causes, and the immediate causes were 3 overgrown trees and a computer bug.
And that shut down the whole system.
And that shut down the whole system, and that's because it's so incredibly interlocked. That you can take out a couple of lines. So trees grow, and it's the utilities responsible to keep them cut around power lines. But there's trees everywhere in America, so that's just hard. And the squirrels, there are squirrel outages all the time. Like every day, there's a squirrel outage somewhere in the U.S. I don't quote me on that, but it's something very, very high like that. Like it's a shocking number of outages. They tend to be sort of short. But the tree problem is that trees come into contact with power lines, and they used to have to be 5 inches away. And there are places now in California where they're arguing for 1 inch. But 1 inch, if you're not out there somewhere between April and June, that 1 inch, the tree's going to grow that 1 inch.
Right.
So the trees come into contact with the lines. The lines either arc, which is to say they shoot a bolt of lightning out at the tree, or they'll short out. And what happened in 2003 is that a line shorted out, a line arced. Another line came into contact with the tree, which was overgrown. And that one shorted out, and then another one came into contact with a tree that was overgrown, and that one shorted out. And then lines began automatically protecting themselves. And this is a lot like having a fuse box in your home. So when they are being asked to carry more electricity than they're rated for, they'll actually turn themselves off automatically. So this was happening. And in the meantime, there was a computer bug in the control room of First Energy, which is the Ohio utility, where it wasn't a blackout yet, but the thing that would become a blackout was propagating within their territory. And their screens were not renewing, and the buzzers were not going off, and the lights were not blinking, saying there's a problem. They just didn't know, and they'd had a computer upgrade the night before, and so those alarms were not functioning. And so it sort of took too long. People call them on the phone, like, hey.
Like, what's going on?
You're looking funny. And they'd be like, what's looking funny? And then somebody else would call and say, like, okay, there's something wrong over here. And after a series of those phone calls, they figured out that something was happening. But by the time they had figured it out, it was the sort of the self-propagating nature of the blackout was already too far along. And so then, as we know, and what New York ended up doing, interestingly, I didn't know this at all before I started researching the book, but they saw a giant amount of electricity being sucked out of their system toward Ohio, and they noticed this happening, and then bang, it basically came back as a wave back in to New York, and they said there's a problem here, and they islanded New York State. And as soon as they did that, so that means they cut themselves off from Ohio and from the rest of the electricity moving around on the grid. And as soon as they did that, they were producing too much electricity for their own state to use in this problem of always balancing electricity. And so all of their system just shut itself down automatically. So so the New York State blackout was actually was accomplished self-protectively. And here's the funny thing: to make an electromagnet work, which electromagnets are how we make electricity, you actually have to have electricity. So a power plant, people will roll in a diesel generator to restart a power plant, because if there's a thorough enough blackout, there's no way to get it going again. You actually need an electric current to make it start to run.
Oh, the irony there.
Yeah, I know, exactly. And also funny that you just imagine the utility being like, somebody go find us a generator.
It's kind of sad, quite frankly.
We have to start our nuclear power plant back up again.
It simultaneously scares me, frightens me, and makes me laugh. So it was essentially like one big domino effect. Once one thing happened, one thing right after that happened. And how many people were out of electricity for I guess, whatever amount of time that was?
10 million people in Ontario and 45 million people in 8 U.S. states.
So because a few fallen trees and a computer bug, millions of people lost power. And I mean, that's a perfect microcosm of what the current problem is. We have this aging issue on top. While the grid is aging, we're also trying to incorporate it and digitize it and making it into a smart grid, which then makes it susceptible to computer bugs and maybe even cyber attacks, which is something that's being talked about. How can we solve that? Because I mean, I think changing it and digitizing it is a smart move in many respects, but maybe not. I'm kind of conflicted in that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, the question of digitizing it. In a way, it's going to happen because we're computerizing everything, and it does all of the computerization that we add to the grid. It actually does make it work better. Even something as simple as a smart meter, which people hate. I mean, it was very fun in doing the research for this book, just like looking at all of the stories of how much people just hated smart meters and just hated them. You know, they're sending suspicious packages to the people putting smart meters up in Las Vegas. You know, like what? What is that? But it's because there's something about this idea that information makes us vulnerable. Right? It makes us vulnerable to spying. It makes us vulnerable to attack. And we don't really trust the utilities. We don't really trust them to do things that are in our best interest.
Right.
We don't know how much our electricity costs. We don't know why our bill is structured the way that it's structured. They've never really been our friends. They give us this thing. They we get a bill from them and we have electricity for the most part, right? But there's no love lost between people and their utilities. It's sometimes there's active hatred. There's a kind of like
passive annoyance.
And so I think that that means that even well-intentioned reforms that they make tend to be a hard sell. And digitization does in fact mean that they can get a lot more information about us, which is useful to them in keeping the grid working, and maybe in other ways too, but certainly it's useful for them in keeping the grid working. But it also means that there is a hackability to the infrastructure, and that's not addressed sort of in a federal or sort of overarching way. And you know, the thing about being vulnerable as a nation to hatreds of various sorts is that when there's an opening, people take it. So it's certainly something to be aware of. I tend to feel like, given the fact that squirrels are so threatening to the grid right now, it's almost more important to think about ways that we can just deal with that problem as opposed to the hacker problem, which isn't to discount the hacker problem at all, but it's to also sort of focus us on things that are really easy to overlook. It's like that statistic that more Americans were killed by lawnmowers last year than by terrorists. You know, but we don't have any great, like, there's no Department of Government to deal with lawnmower safety issues, right? And that's not in the least to belittle the sort of structure of international anger that is currently affecting the nation. But nevertheless, like, how do you deal with trees? How do you deal with squirrels? How do you deal with vines? How do you deal with the fact that electric companies don't own their power plants anymore, and so anybody essentially can build a power plant anywhere they want to, and the electric company has to buy that power and move it to market? Like, that's it seems so simple, right? But actually, it doesn't make sense to them, and it makes the grid very delicate.
Yeah, screw ISIS. I'm more worried about trees than
squirrels. I mean, you can be worried about both, I guess is what I'm saying. Like it's fair to think about both of these problems, and to lobby that both of them get dealt with in a smart way.
I'll never look at a squirrel the same way.
And somebody made a joke to me today. They were saying that Florida is just being impossibly recalcitrant in terms of allowing solar panels to go up. Their utilities just have their feet so deep in the mud to keep things the way that they were in the good old fossil fuel days. And you know, so I was talking to somebody about this, and they were like, well, maybe they just think that they don't have a time to pay back on investment anyway because they're all going to be underwater. And I thought, yeah, then there's that problem, right? It's like if we don't convert somehow, if we don't figure out somehow to be able to integrate things that don't produce greenhouse gases into our electricity system at a very, very high rate, then we have, you know, sea level rise and hurricanes, and we don't want that either.
Glad you brought that up, because switching to renewables, when we do have a bit of a roadmap. Stanford University scientist Mark Jacobson, he came out with a plan for transforming the United States from dependence on fossil fuels to 100% renewable energy by 2050. So simply, it's more of a matter of choice of doing it. Now, I know part of that is the cost of insulating the grid is supposedly about estimated at $1 billion, and there was something in 2010 called the Grid Act of 2010, where a grid protection bill was passed in the U.S. House but was rejected by the Senate. Do you think part of that is because of the utilities and the lobbyist movement there?
Yes.
I know, and I hate to put you in that position.
No, I mean, yes, absolutely. But I think part of it too is that as long as the lights are on pretty much all the time, and we have a very high tolerance for blackouts in the U.S. We have a lot of them. Most of them are short. But as long as the lights are on most of the time, and the system is working well most of the time, there isn't a sense of urgency. So there's all of these patches and inventions and hope-for solutions going on behind the scenes, but we don't really see very much of it. And by we, I mean also senators. And I think that is the part of it, that it doesn't have the feel of an emergency in the way that other things do. Because by and large, like, the work that's being done is working. And that's one of the things that I really wanted to make clear in the book, is that this is not like, oh, we aren't paying any attention to the system and it's going to fall apart before we take action. We're actually taking action all the time. And every action we take, it has ramifications. And each of those ramifications then needs to be treated with another action. And some of the actions don't make any sense at all. Like, some of the stuff we do, it doesn't make any sense at all. Or some of it has to do only with what people, what everyday people want, like wireless transmission of electricity over short distances in houses and coffee shops. Like, it's coming. It's just going to be something that we have in 5 years. And we can't see that at all right now. We can't see it at all. But that also has an impact. So the grid is actually, what's amazing about it is like a storm at sea. It's so big, and people's actions are so little, and they're happening everywhere. Apps, smart thermostats, towns aggregating and taking over the governance of their own grid, people getting off the grid, people building microgrids and nanogrids, and building there's new alliances for cross-state transmission. It's all happening. But if you just sit in your house and it starts to get dark, you turn on the lights. It's like, oh, it's like the same old grid it ever was, right? And one more thing actually about that is that the Senate may have been unwilling to pass that bill, but the U.S. military is one of the foremost builders of microgrids in the world. They are turning all of their bases into microgrids. And one of the reasons for that is that the standard electric power in the U.S. now is just not secure enough for them. It just goes out too often. So even if government is not quite aware of the situation, a piece of the government is, and they're taking action base by base to build up an electricity system which is different. And often run on renewables, partially, interestingly enough. So it's not like they're building little fossil fuel systems. They're building integrated systems that usually do have some sort of diesel, but they also have wind and solar.
Obviously, that says a lot. I know you've lived internationally outside of America as well. Do you notice that these issues are only relegated to America, or these are issues that are worldwide or even systemic?
They're definitely also happening in Europe, though part of the reason that I took on this project was that I was coming back from Eastern Europe and we never had blackouts. So here you are in the former communist world, and it works great, And so there was something weird about that too. Like, what? What is this? This place is supposed to be a mess, and the electricity system is better than in Oregon. That doesn't really make sense. And I think that the traveling sort of sparked that disconnect. But Germany is having huge problems right now. They're dealing with them in somewhat different ways, but they too are trying to orchestrate a very fast transition to a high level of renewables, and it's hard. It's hard to keep the grid stable. It's hard to keep emissions down. It's hard to keep the utilities from just failing. It's hard to keep people from going off the grid. Denmark can produce more than 100% of its electricity with wind at any given moment, and so they're sending electricity out into Europe, wind power all the time. They're selling it all the time. But they have this great advantage, which is that Norway is essentially a giant battery. It has huge hydroelectric dams. And those are very, very good for balancing variable generation like wind. And the other thing is that France is 75% nuclear. So Europe also has that available to them. So they don't have states, they have countries. And those countries have made very different decisions in the way that states in the U.S. have made quite different decisions about how to make power and how to make a transition to making cleaner energy. But they also need to work together and are trying to figure out how to work together to bring Europe as a whole into something like a greener, sort of more secure energy future. But in general, their grid actually does work better than ours.
Is there a plan that we should follow, a country's lead that America should follow, as much as Americans hate to believe that?
You know what? I don't think we can. Because for the most part, everywhere else, not necessarily in developing or newly developed countries, but in Europe for sure, in Russia, South Korea has the best grid in the world. Transition is in China, of course. The transition is being done from the top down. So there are people at the top who actually run things, and they make decisions about how it's going to go. And in the U.S., it just doesn't work that way. It's just chaos, essentially. And so there's lots of different utilities. Some of them are trying to make money. Some of them don't need to make money. Some are municipally owned. Some are investor owned. Some are actually just like securities companies. They're not even utilities anymore. They're just in sort of investment entities. There are the different states, there are different counties, there are different towns, and they're all making rules that to varying degrees comply or don't comply with state law or with federal law. And I think that's what makes Texas an interesting case, is because the federal law governs cross-border transmission of electricity. Texas uses 90% of the electricity it makes. So it's not importing electricity and it's not exporting electricity, which means that they can just decide for themselves what they want to do and how they want to manage their state, the power within their state. And so there is no authority. We don't have one guy at the top who's going to say, here's how it will be. Even if there's a bill, it's always built in. Hillary Clinton has this big infrastructure spending plan if she's elected. And it's built in, like chaos is built in to it. And the idea is that you give money, you find a way to give money to good ideas. So you find a way to make sure that good ideas grow and that they get built into the infrastructure. Maybe not nationally, but in certain pockets. And that's just nowhere else in the world is doing it like that. I think there's a lot of innovation that comes out of it. I think there's some very, very good ideas and some ridiculous ideas, but you get you get a cycle of renewal and collapse, which is quite quick in the U.S. And because of that, there are sort of the occasional big step forward that excites the imagination. And I think that's one of the things, again, that people don't necessarily realize, is that the electricity business right now is a very, very exciting place to be. And it's for a long time it was not an interesting sector to work in, and now it is. And so there are college graduates coming out and being like, I want to go into the electricity game. There are people in Silicon Valley who are like, I want to invent for electricity. I want to come up with new products and new hardware, not just new software, but like new hardware to make things more efficient, to make things interoperable, to make things futuristic. There's all of these sort of different pushes on the system right now. So, but it doesn't matter what I think, because that's how it works anyway. So I'm certainly not going to say like, we need a Stalin to make our electricity grid better, even if it would actually get better faster.
You gotta take the long
because I kind of like that quality of that sort of like make a buck quick with a good idea that drives a lot of American innovation. But that's my own bias.
Well, that's innovation in general.
I'm not sure it's the best way at all to be going about the transition, but it is the way we are going about it. And I think it's nice to think, okay, so since we're like that, how can we encourage that to make it a little bit more, to make sure that good ideas don't fall between the cracks, essentially.
And you preach in the book, I think above all, that Americans really can't be passive in remaking our energy infrastructure. I mean, what can people do to not be passive and be active about it? Because to me, it seems that the public does want renewables, and they are active in it for the most part. But what can people who maybe can't afford solar panels do, for example?
Right, exactly. First, I think that any big movement, sort of groundswell, which is sort of where our grid is at today, it needs to let the disinterested people be disinterested without leaving them behind. So there are always going to be people who don't care and who want to come home and have their electricity just work, and they don't want to have to think about it, and they don't want to have to press a button or 15 buttons, and they don't want to have to go out and demonstrate and all that stuff. And I would even include myself in that category. I am not interested really in learning about how to make my house be a smarter, better, more efficient, more radical part of the electricity machine. But I would really like it if the companies that interact with my house were doing that. So I think which is sort of a weird way to say it, but I think you can do stuff like buy an Energy Star refrigerator, which might cost a little bit more money, but it's insanely more efficient. Or in places where the grid is starting to be able to be capable of communicating with electronic devices like a dishwasher, to say right now there's a lot of power on the lines and nobody using it. Why don't you wash the dishes now? To look at those kinds of machines, and if you can afford them, to sort of give the grid the chance to work on itself. That said, there are a lot of people who are organizing in their communities just to sort of tackle the problem of utility incalcitrance. And that seems to happen community by community, state by state. And, if you're interested in that level of activism, it's certainly something that's worth supporting, because the people who are doing it have done a lot of research and have tried to figure out ways that they can, if their utility will not give them the amount of wind power, for example, that they want, to sort of say, okay, we're aggregating, and we're taking control over how our power is made within the lines of this particular community. And that's happening more and more. That level of community radicalism is happening more and more often, and states are putting up battles to make it not happen, and they're losing them. So I think that's also interesting. Stephen Chu, when he was the Secretary of Energy, he suggested that every house have two buttons, like a green button with a tree on it and a pink button with a pig on it. And I think that's a great idea. So you just come home and you're like, I'm really hot and I want my air conditioning to be on full bore right now, and you smack the pig button. And then everything in your house goes for maximum consumption. But you make the choice so that it's not that you're always at maximum consumption, because that's where we're at right now. Where you can say, I feel fine, I'm going to hit the green button, it's a regular day, and you just hit the green button, and then everything sort of takes care of itself. So that level of automation, that's what I would push for. Where people could override something, but for the most part, everything runs more efficiently.
Looking into your crystal ball, do you see that happening? Where do you see us in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years?
I think that if, barring some sort of unforeseen disaster, black swan kind of thing, I think in 15 years we will have figured out how to integrate renewables into the grid, but the grid might not. It might not be a big grid anymore. It might be cobbled together out of a lot of much, much smaller systems.
May there not even be a grid at all?
Just houses. I think we can't give up electricity without giving up everything. I think there will be some sort of grid, I suspect. Because you can't, at least there was nobody that I talked to in researching this book, and I talked to a lot of people who are very angry about all kinds of things, there was nobody who thought that electricity should not be available for everyone. So if we're going to have electricity available for everyone, then we need to have a grid.
You know, some of your past research was on several falling nations, including the Soviet Union. If a countrywide blackout did occur, or something on that level, and I know the blackout is a bit of a misnomer, the term, but could this lead to some type of breakdown in the country if this isn't addressed sooner than later?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I just read a wonderful thing actually online that was it started out with the story of all of the old rotten refrigerators that were out after Katrina, and then out again in Louisiana after these recent floods. You know, and you turn off power and you have a refrigerator, and a week and a half later you have to throw the thing away because it is the most disgusting mass that is imaginable. Like, what happens to the insides of things? So a power outage is funny and sort of convivial for a day, even 2 days, and then it's irritating, and at 5 days it starts to be a problem. And you go longer than 5 days, and you have a social breakdown. So, yes. I can't quite imagine how that would happen short of a very smart terrorist attack. Mm-hmm. But I think that because even the big storms, even after Superstorm Sandy, there were places that were out of power for 3 weeks. But by and large, after 5 days, most people had their electricity back working, or they had neighbors or a workplace. They had somewhere they could get that had power. So this idea that a power outage is sort of a blanket phenomenon, it's not totally the case, because as the utilities work, the power comes on here and there, and people start to be able to take care of themselves again. And also, one of the things that's happening when I said that the grid might be getting smaller, or sort of be made up of these bubbles that clump together. I mean, I said a swarm before, but maybe it's more like your town or your neighborhood has a microgrid, and you're pushed up against a transit system which has a microgrid, and on the other side of that is another town that has a microgrid. And for the most part, all of these are interlocking, and they work like and look just like the big grid. But when there's some sort of big outage, they can island themselves, and I think that there's a lot of security that can come from that kind of action, so that there's a linking and unlinking feature, which is becoming more and more popular. I'm not sure that that's where we'll be in 15 years, but I see a lot of people, every time there's a tragedy of some sort, normally storm-made, the idea of microgrids comes sort of up in popularity, and it gets adopted by some state legislature somewhere to build a bunch of them. So to sort of see uneven recovery that then feels like care actually to people, because that's the thing, is when there's a big outage, we don't have the resources anymore to care for ourselves or for other people, or to connect to people who aren't just immediately around us. And you add 1 or 2 houses or 1 or 2 blocks in an area that have power, and that all changes. And there were studies after Superstorm Sandy that said that the people who were most traumatized were the ones who didn't have, where there was nobody in their neighborhood that had some kind of power.
Let's end off where electricity really began. What do you think Tesla and Edison would say about that? Did they ever envision the grid lasting this long? I mean, how would they handle this situation?
Well, Tesla had this idea that we would be able to communicate with each other over the oceans instantaneously, and probably with moving pictures. So we have that, and he simultaneously had this idea that we'd be able to put something up in the sky that would produce electricity that we could all use without wires. It was all about long distance transmission of wireless transmission of electricity, which nobody Apparently he didn't know how to do it either. Nobody knows how to do it now also. But he thought that there would be this sort of just ambient electricity that we would all have access to and all be able to use all the time. So there was a vision for an electrified world that was not a wired world. And I think with telecommunications we start to feel this. Like, we have a communications world that even though it's wired locally. So for the most part, we don't need to worry about those wires anymore. The cell phone tower is still wired in. Our phone still needs to plug in sometimes to get electric power, but the telecommunications stuff works wirelessly. And so there's this desire to do that with electricity too. Like, can't we just have it? Can't we just have it everywhere and not have to plug anything in anymore? And that's really, really hard to do, it turns out.
I would imagine, yeah.
So if there's if there is sort of a move to this sort of tiny level, which again I'm not sure is where we'll go, or if we go that way, it may be the East Coast that goes that way, but not the West Coast. But these sort of smaller pods of smaller grids, I guess you would say, because there's still, if with the solar panels you're still making it, with your battery you're storing it, with your wires in your walls you're transmitting it, and then your machines are all using it. So it's still exactly the same thing. It's still a grid. But if that were the way that we would go, you could technically get rid of all of the wires that connect all of those houses together. But why would you do that? What would be the benefit of that, unless there's some sort of larger social breakdown?
You have my vote for Secretary of Energy, Dr. Bakke, so I'm going to put it in your hands.
I'm not sure that I want the job, because I tell you, the natural gas network is a disaster. So it's like there's the problem of the grid, but then there's like this leaky natural gas network that and oil interests, and the Secretary of Energy has a lot to deal with besides just reforming the grid.
I think we have a brighter future, and I think your book shows us, and like we said, the biggest thing that, for me, what I got from your book is that Americans, they can't be passive. This is something that we are a part of, and we can do something about.
Yeah, we can, and I think it's also really easy to just now, having thought about all these things, open your eyes and look around and see, like, what is available that can be changed. And often, there's just a little box on your utility bill that says, pay $3 more, support solar power. Whatever. Like, you can just check the box. And it's this tiny little thing, but boom, then there's that $3 is going to help build a wind farm.
And it all adds up.
Not that you want to give your money, not that you want to give those $3 to the utility, but there's like all of these opportunities that are around us all of the time. And it's just sort of like to look at them and sort of say, like, that one yes, that one no, that one yes, that one no. I'm going to go out for this, I'm going to sit at home for that. That kind of consciousness of the system being alive, keeping us alive, but being alive itself, and that we have the possibility to contribute to that, I think is amazing.
Just don't sit there. In fact, the first thing you should do is pick up Dr. Bakke's book, The Grid, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Energy Future. Doctor, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the interview. It's great.
All right, we'll be back with the Mind's Eye wrap-up after this quick break. And welcome back to the Mind's Eye show wrap-up. Our little ado before we say our final goodbyes for the evening. If you hope to reimagine the grid for the 21st century as Dr. Gretchen Bakke's perspective, check out her website, bakkeconsolidated.org. That's BAKKE consolidated.org. Keeping an eye to the future, the Mind's Eye returns next week with Professor Aaron John Gulyas on his book, Conspiracy Theories, The Roots, Themes, and Propagation of Paranoid, Political, and Cultural Narratives. We'll examine various conspiracy theories, aliens, Nazis, New World Order, mind control technology, and we're going to provide a very unique view on U.S. history, and we're going to highlight some of the fears of these conspiracy theories, real and unfounded. For more information on both guests, take a gander at our website, themindseyemedia.com, or again, follow us on social media, facebook.com/Mind's Eye Show, and the same for Twitter at Mind's Eye Show. Unfortunately, it is that time, but we only part to meet again. Until the next one, I'm your host, Brian Turnov, and this is the Mind's Eye Show on Z Talk.